Welcome to the Experience Darden podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Carissa Sanchez. Carissa is a graduate in our full-time MBA class of 2020, and she and I recently connected to talk more about her background, her decision to pursue an MBA, what led her to Darden, what she's been up to since graduation, including her new role in venture capital, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to Experience Darden so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Carissa Sanchez. Carissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm super excited to chat with you today, share a bit about my story. It's always so fun to be able to stay connected with the Darden community.
Yeah, how are things going? How are you doing? Where are you calling in from today?
Yeah, doing well. I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado, and we're in the midst of, it's like 60 degrees today, and then tomorrow we have a winter weather advisory for snow. So it's keeping us on our toes.
Still ski season? Can you still ski?
Absolutely, yes. We're skiing a little bit during the weekday last week, and then we're hiking over the weekend since it was nice and sunny. So a little bit of everything right now.
Nice. That's the great benefit of being in Colorado. Well, thank you so much for taking some time for our conversation today. Want to talk about your career journey and kind of where you are now. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about who you are. Tell us about you, your background.
Yeah, for sure. My name is Carissa Sanchez. I was a Darden 2020 alum, and I'm currently working at Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. It's a venture capital fund focused on investing and partnering with Native American, Indigenous, First Nations entrepreneurs. And I'm, initially from the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe out in southern Arizona. And our ancestral lands are spread out sort of between northern Mexico in the state of Sonora, and then also southern Arizona, so close to Tucson. Grew up there in a small rural desert town near the border. I did high school out in Phoenix, and then was the first in my family to go to college. So I was fortunate enough to study mechanical engineering at Yale. And then, spent a few years in aerospace manufacturing, came out to Darden for my MBA, which is a wonderful time. And then afterwards was at DaVita in the healthcare space for a little bit, took a micro retirement, which I think Forbes is sort of coining that phrase right now. And then about 6 months ago, pivoted into venture capital with Raven.
Well, lots of things to talk about there. So you mentioned being an engineering student, undergrad. What got you interested in pursuing an MBA?
Yeah, so right after, college, I joined Alcoa, a pretty big, manufacturing company, and was there in a leadership rotation program. So, learned all the engineering stuff. We were working on jet engine components. I was in rural Texas, Michigan, Indiana, kind of floating around the country. And one of the plant managers who sort of took me under his wing at some point said that I had an analytical mind about me, which is, I guess, a quote that sort of stuck with me. But he was the first to suggest that I kind of look at the business operations management side of things. So that really kind of turned me on to looking into MBA programs, and the rest is history.
And ultimately, how did you learn about Darden? Because Charlottesville's not just down the street from Arizona or even New Haven. So how did you get interested in Darden?
Yeah, totally. So a few things here. I would say one is the consortium. I cannot give enough love or gratitude for the consortium. I think anyone who's kind of looking at the caliber of school of Darden is instantly, thinking of a ton of the other programs out there that are similarly ranked. And I looked, all over the place, as everybody does. And once I was kind of considering the price tag, the student experience, and all the stats around career placement, I sat down and had a hard conversation with myself. And for me, as a first gen student, my first job out of college, I was making more money than I was ever raised on. So no one was going to help me pay for another degree. I didn't want to go into a ton of debt. ended up with an amazing MBA brand on my resume, grew a ton during the 2 years on grounds, and was super fortunate to not have any debt hanging over my head. Um, and then something I realized was that a lot of the sort of like post MBA recruitment opportunities, as far as careers go, were going to be, pretty much the same. I got exactly what I wanted out of Darden. Um, the other piece I'll say about Darden is that with me, being from Yale University in undergrad, something I realized in my first 2 years working was that my network was capped at the Ivy League. And I didn't necessarily, need another Ivy League brand on my resume to tap into, a business school or a law school or a medical school network. So long as someone saw, Yale on my LinkedIn profile, they were probably going to take my call. But something I was lacking was access to kind of the quote unquote public Ivies, or like the really big, great public universities out there. So really kind of wanted to tap into that, and Darden was a great place to do it.
You mentioned being first generation, first in your family to go to college, and obviously first in your family to pursue an MBA. What was that MBA experience like? The adjustment to obviously Yale, obviously widely known, it's a very strong undergraduate program, but being a graduate business student is always an adjustment. So, what was that like for you?
Oh, it was a wild ride. That first kind of transition into Darden, I grew exponentially in a really short amount of time. Um, I also grew really close to my classmates in a short amount of time because you're in the trenches together, relying on each other to get your cases done for class the next day, for recruiting, and going through hard things together makes people bond. So it was a good time.
What section were you?
I was in Section A, go Lions. And I actually met my husband in Section A. So all good things coming out of Darden.
What was your favorite thing about that first year? Obviously, you mentioned the bonding, getting to know your classmates, but does something stand out from that time when you think back on it?
Oh man, let's see. It's a tough one. It's a blur. That time flies by so fast. Um, I don't know if it's a specific experience, but I remember sort of after the core sitting down and talking with classmates about, like what just happened in the last semester. And we were all agreed that the core is like a beautiful forcing function in making us really good at prioritization and decision making. Because, 4 to 5 cases a day, leading you into the afternoon, and then having, club meetings to go to and recruiting and coffee chats, getting your homework done, going to office hours with a professor. There's so much happening that you sort of have to practice every single day. What's important to me? What do I really want to get out of this? Um, and just making the decisions day in, day out to get through the program, which is something that it seems so unique to Darden, I think, because that prioritization decision making is something so critical to business leadership wherever you end up at. And it's something that's, I think, impossible to get good at by just reading a book or doing a case study. You truly have to exercise that muscle. Um, so that was something that just really was memorable, was hard, and was amazing to be able to experience.
Yeah, how did you figure out how to prioritize things? You mentioned you can't read it in a book, but sort of learn by trial and error, perhaps. How did you figure out how to prioritize things?
Yeah, so my second year coach gave some really astute advice early on, and she said that there are kind of three big things going on during your MBA program. One is academics, one is socializing, and the other is recruiting. All of us are there to get jobs, and most often, unless you're some kind of superhuman, you have to choose two to really lean in on, because there's just not enough time in the day or energy in your body to get through all of it and do it all well. So I had that kind of mindset going into it. I wanted to learn, but I wasn't, set on getting straight A's in Darden just because, no one's looking at your transcript really, unless you're trying to go into investment banking, perhaps. Socializing was high up for me, but I was really indexed on recruiting. So I think I early on was, you know, thinking through and said, all right, I'm here to get the job of my dreams, and then I want to come out with great friends and great network connections.
Talk about your career goals. So you mentioned you were in business school to get the job of your dreams. How did your career goals evolve? How did you engage with like what you wanted to do next?
Yeah, they evolved a lot. So I'd mentioned I was in engineering and aerospace manufacturing, and came into the MBA thinking I wanted to do one of those big kind of management, general like leadership development programs with a GE, with some sort of big company, because that's sort of just what I knew. During my interview to get into Darden, my interviewer at the end of it actually said, "Why aren't you considering consulting?" And that's a big thing for all the business schools. Um, so I looked into it, and then I was, considering all the things I mentioned. Consortium. I came through Management Leadership Tomorrow, another one of the big orgs to help underserved communities come into business school programs. Um, and I was fortunate enough to start first year of Darden with an internship offer for DaVita, which is one of the, really great names. Darden has a great relationship with them, to do their leadership development program. And that put me in a really unique position because I was able to then get really sort of prescriptive with my recruiting experience on grounds during first year. And I basically only looked at, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and AT Kearney because they had a lot of aerospace stuff going on. And then I recruited that, and I, wound up with a BCG offer. So my career trajectory sort of shifted then. I was with BCG for my summer internship, and then found that it wasn't really for me. Had some more conversations with myself about sort of what I can do, and balancing the desired sort of socioeconomic mobility, freedom, with something that meant a lot to me and what I wanted to do with my time. So coming into second year, I actually went back to DaVita and said, it's really been on my heart. Like, I'm going to get a great job coming out of Darden regardless. I want to be able to do something that's impacting tribal nations. And DaVita has a dialysis clinic that's on my tribe's reservation. So really wanted to dig in there and sort of share the corporate, trajectory of things with some social impact. So was able to do that. It evolved a ton over my 2 years.
That definitely sounds like it. So you get to DaVita, and for folks who are less familiar with this company, you want to share a little bit more about what the company does and the nature of the program you were in.
Yeah, so DaVita is a Fortune 200 company, that does a ton of dialysis. So all over the U.S., if patients have kidney failure or their kidneys aren't functioning quite as they should be, DaVita provides a life-saving treatment that um, helps the kidneys function or replaces kidney function. And then as far as the program I was in, DaVita has this great Redwoods leadership development program, recruits out of some of the really great MBA programs. And right out of Darden, they gave me a $6 million P&L to run, and I was responsible for a dialysis clinic, serving Native American patients, serving everybody else in the community. There were, let's see, I think around 30 clinicians and technicians that I was managing, um, and around 200 patients. So it's a lot of responsibility coming out of Darden. The only program I could think of that actually like gave you a P&L responsibility straight out of the program. So same thing. I just like grew exponentially in a very short amount of time. Being in the clinic day in, day out, helping the technicians open the facility at 5 a.m., working with patients when they, had issues with their insurance and trying to make sure they could get their treatments. So yeah, it was a good time.
Super interesting. That sounds like a lot of responsibility very early in your career. Did you feel like any experiences at Darden had prepared you for having that scope so early in your career?
Totally. Um, when I think back on Darden, especially coming in as an engineer, I was, familiar with Excel and the quantitative side of things. I'd had a lot less exposure to kind of the soft skills and just like the human conversations that have to happen. And I think Darden prepared me in the core and, day in, day out for the entire 2 years of just sitting in a case classroom and being faced with difficult situations. I think of like, Martin Davidson's classes or Ed Freeman's classes, and just sitting there with this really difficult issue, whether it's like, you know, this guy who everybody loves and is getting up there in age, he's not performing, so we have to fire him. And that's the type of thing where you don't really have any way to prepare for that situation in the workplace. But certainly having those types of, you know, conversations and debates in the classroom was super helpful to just kind of, you know, realize that I had the muscle, and then be able to build it in the workplace.
So how do you get from DaVita to where you are today? That seems like a pretty big shift in your career.
It was, yeah. So I was at DaVita for about 4 years. Um, had an amazing time, grew a ton. Some of my best friends in Denver now are still at DaVita. And I think I sort of had that same repeat conversation with myself about, economic security, doing well in my career, but also trying to balance what was meaningful to me, the type of impact I wanted to be making in the world. And I think with DaVita, I got to touch a lot of tribal communities, a lot of, lower income communities, and wanted to just kind of, do something else. I think 4 years at DaVita, I'd never spent anywhere in my career, that long a period of time. So it was sort of time for something new. And then I also, honestly just kind of got to a point of burnout and took a leave of absence. I'm convinced that millennials and Gen Z are going to really make the leave of absence and then returning to the same workplace a thing. I think the 3 month sabbatical is phenomenal for recovery. Just, resting, doing something you enjoy, getting refocused. So I took a leave of absence, and then I kind of went the rogue way and took a micro retirement. I think that's a term that Forbes is kind of coining right now. But just took time for myself to kind of reevaluate. I think back to the first generation student aspect of things, I kind of checked all the boxes that I, ever wanted to in my career. I, owned a house, I got married, I had a dog, I'd had the downtown office with the view of the Rocky Mountains. I was just like, all right, I've done what I needed to do. Darden, gave me all these opportunities. And then really was just back to the question of how do I make as much impact and do good for my people and tribal nations as possible. So it's kind of, took most of 2024 off. I was spending a lot of time with horses again. I was taking classes at my tribe's community college, learning the language. And then I guess in probably the most caricature, Darden networking story possible, kind of accidentally ended up in an interview process for venture capital at an indigenous focused firm, and it all kind of just fell into place.
So was there a Darden relationship that led you to this particular firm?
So this was through a consortium. So certainly the general MBA pathway, there are so many opportunities during the program to interact with other business schools that are similar. So this was another friend from a different business school who was working at Raven pretty much for the first couple of years after we graduated. And then I, decided to reconnect with him, hadn't been working for a while, and was basically like, hey, do you want a free intern? I'm trying to learn finance and see if that's something I'd want to get into. And he said no, but he introduced me to the general partner of the firm, and we had a coffee chat that turned into accidentally a first round interview. So yeah, that connection was, amazing to have, and definitely forged in the Darden times.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about your pivot into venture capital. A number of prospective students are interested in VC, and there's just not a lot of jobs in venture capital, and it can be very, very difficult to get a job in venture capital immediately after your MBA program. Certainly, one of the realities of the search. So, any advice for people who are listening to this who are interested in VC? Anything you would encourage them to think about?
Yeah, agreed. It's really hard. I didn't even know what VC was during Darden. And there were a few folks trying to get into it. It's so network driven. Um, Surprisingly so, even more than, you think of having to spend a lot of your first year going to investment banking or consulting, recruiting. Um, I would say for anyone interested in VC, just don't be afraid to send the cold LinkedIn message. I think I was doing a lot of that, and just let your kind of interests be known. And I think a lot of the skill set, even once you're in VC, to kind of get a hold of deals and get your name out there, is just letting people know what you're up to, so it's in the back of their mind to share. I think for me, another sort of happenstance thing was I told um, the husband of another Darden friend who I'm really close to that I was you know basically offering myself up as a free intern for a summer, and then he was like, "Oh man, I know this guy who's in native private equity. Let me introduce you." And then that guy um, ended up kind of like recommending some books to read about VC just to get the basics of kind of the industry language. Um, and he introduced me to a ton of folks who helped me figure out that I really wanted to be in VC and do interview prep and all the things. So, yeah, I think just kind of put yourself out there.
What is it that appealed to you about venture capital?
Yeah. So I think, between VC and private equity, they're sort of in the same sphere. Um, since I personally had no kind of concrete finance background, all of my experience was operations or consulting, healthcare strategy. Um, VC was a great fit because in VC you're looking at super early stage companies that you can't necessarily stare at 10 years of financials. They're probably pretty new, so it's a more I think interesting due diligence process because you're just kind of assessing the team. Do they have the right drive? Do they have the right combination of skill sets within the team? Um, is their product, in a place that's really slated to grow in the next couple of years? So I think I kind of like those broad, open-ended questions.
And how has it been going so far? Obviously, you're off your micro retirement, which, by the way, I did not know that was a thing. So I learned something new today myself. But how has it been going in your new role?
It's been amazing. I think something that sort of took me by surprise out the gate, um, for other folks from underrepresented backgrounds out there, is my boss is this First Nations Indigenous woman who's an absolute beast, and I respect her more than I could ever imagine wanting to even respect a boss. So that's just really cool, someone to truly look up to who kind of reflects my values background, which is sometimes hard to come across in corporate America. Um, let's see. Early in the year, I closed my first deal. Super excited. I'll give a plug for Fetch Goat. We started a partnership with them, and they have this crazy SaaS product that maybe ties back to the the engineering background in me. Um, they basically are, you know, using AI and machine learning to help companies who have deliveries, whether it's working with DaVita to pick up blood samples to go get tested, or delivering food, beverages, whatever it is, helping them optimize the routes. So that's a Cherokee founder who's also a Navy vet, and he's been really great as a mentor as well, and another face out there that kind of just reflects what I come from.
What is the particular thesis for the firm? Any particular kinds of, I mean, obviously, I would imagine the founder and their background is important, but tell us a little bit more about the thesis the firm uses.
Yeah, love to. So Raven focuses specifically on investing in Native American, First Nations, Indigenous founders, or Indigenous owned businesses in the U.S. and Canada, um, and it gets a little broad sector wise. So we're industry agnostic. Um, just kind of with the goal of, you know, impacting well-being for Native peoples, whether that means, the founder gets a really great, you know, acquisition opportunity and is able to pass on that family wealth down the way, um, or it's something that's, a product serving Native Americans and helping them with education or, language revitalization, whatever it may be. So we're out there.
Do you think if you told your MBA self that you'd be doing this, 5, 6 years after your time at Darden, do you think you'd be surprised? Your earlier version of you would be surprised that you've ended up at a venture capital firm?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think beyond surprised. And some friends and I often joke that, first year of Darden, if, Mark Lipson and Luann Lynch from our finance classes and accounting classes could see me now, I think we would all laugh and be like, that's an impossible situation. But I think what's been really cool is that it feels like within VC, I genuinely use what I learned at Darden every single day. Like it's truly an application of the general management curriculum. Is on a daily basis, I might play around in an Excel file and make a financial forecast, but I'm also thinking about strategic roadmaps and CEO compensation, and how do we market this product. So every single day, it's all of it, and I'm really glad I got that foundation.
You mentioned the important role that networking played in your process and landing where you are today. What tips do you have for folks as they think about networking? Because I think sometimes people think about networking in this very transactional way. But listening to your story, it sounded more like you just got curious about what people did and offered maybe help that you could offer. But I'm curious, what advice would you have for our listeners around networking?
Yeah, that's a hot topic. So I think you hit on, something true to me. I just genuinely enjoy building relationships with folks. And I think, early in kind of the VC side of things, I was surprised by the number of folks who genuinely just want to, give first before they necessarily ask for anything. And I think there's something to that. And it reminds me a lot of sort of my kind of, you know, traditional upbringing where you're just there to, help each other out. So if there's, something I can offer, I think just say like, hey, here's what I think I can offer that might align with you, like happy to chat. And also, growing I think the muscle again of just kind of being okay with saying what you need. Um, and then being able to not take it personally if, you know, it doesn't work out with that particular thing. It's not about me. It's about the fact that, what we're working on didn't line up. So I think that's important. Um, Other than that, I think something I've had to work pretty hard on as, a woman, first gen student, all of the things, um, is just being okay taking a space and making the ask and kind of, I think I do the prep offline of like, here's what I, think they need. Here's what I think I can offer. And then trying to make that a concise statement. And eventually it becomes more natural feeling.
And one of the things I think is really interesting about your story, Carissa, is that you started your career after MBA at DaVita with no intention of getting into venture capital, at least at that moment. And then now here you are in venture capital. And as I mentioned, as an admissions team, we talk to so many people who are singularly focused on venture capital and say it's really where they want to be. And it feels a little bit like VC or bust after graduation. But yet there are other ways to get there, or maybe not, maybe a different timeline than what you have in mind. What would you say to folks, given your story and your experience, if they're interested in venture capital, just kind of how they might think about their timeline and how they can get to VC, maybe in a slightly less linear path?
Totally. Yeah. I think something that I've sort of been picking up along the way is that, in VC, there's a similar sort of structure to consulting with, analyst, associate, principal, partner, et cetera. Um, and a lot of folks don't have the kind of straightforward path. Um, I would say, surprisingly, a lot of the true finance skills associated with VC are, taken care of by the folks coming straight out of undergrad. So, you kind of need to be able to know the basics, but I think there's a lot more value for someone with an MBA coming into VC being able to speak to some of that operational experience or, that deep marketing experience or whatever it is, because, there's the first part of VC, which is finding the company, doing the valuation, getting the deal done. But then that company's in your portfolio for, 5, 7, 10 years. And your whole job is to help them, be sure that they're able to scale and grow and make the return that you've promised to your investors. So I think other experiences are super valuable there. It gives you a ton of credibility saying, I also ran a $6 million P&L, or I, spun up this crazy marketing campaign for some Fortune 50 company. So I think that probably doesn't get said quite enough, but it's valuable.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if you feel like this was the exact right timing for you to kind of move into VC, given that you'd already had the experiences you had pre-MBA and then, post-MBA, all the responsibilities you had at DaVita. Like you were able to bring that to bear on the work that you're doing now. Seems like that's something that had some impact for you.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't be able to, support our founders or even empathize with them or have any credibility with them unless I'd had some of this background and kind of time in the weeds, if you will.
Well, a couple more questions here before we wrap up, Carissa. So, when you look back on your time at Darden, what do you think of how do you assess the impact of your Darden experience? What for you was the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact, and it's a theme we've been discussing this whole time, but the network is massive. Um, I think of the travel opportunities to get to hang out with different classmates, and um, there was sort of a running joke. One of my closest friends from Darden, a bunch of us went to Turks and Caicos for her birthday between first and second year, and it was us and then some friends from a different business school as well, and we're all still in touch, and we go back to the Caribbean every couple of years to just hang out. So those types of things are super life giving. Um, as I mentioned, I met my husband, so that's a big networking plus coming through the program. And then I'd alluded to this as well, but just in order for me to break into venture capital and make that wacky of a career pivot, truly so much of the folks I met during my time at Darden were super critical in that. And then more recently, just I think it was last week, another Darden classmate had actually been involved with one of the startups we're diligencing right now. So we were able to just hop on the phone, catch up, talk about family, but then dig into some of the like gritty details of this company's business plan, since she had worked on it back in the day. So the network, it surprises me in a crazy way every now and then.
Do you have a favorite memory when you think about your time in Charlottesville? Something that jumps out. Obviously, you've shared a lot of great things, trips that you've taken with your classmates, and just the bonding nature of the first year experience. But anything you look back on that you feel like sort of epitomizes your experience?
A little bit. So, I'd mentioned kind of horses earlier on and growing up in a rural town. And the teams I've worked with would probably attest to the fact that I am better off kind of managing a group of 20 dogs or a herd of horses or something than I am a strategy team of four. That comes more naturally to me. So during Darden, I worked with the Charlottesville SPCA and was kind of walking dogs and fostering dogs to just, you know, help me kind of work through some of the stresses and keep things fun. And there was one day we went to King Family Vineyards. There's a polo match, pretty much every weekend, and I was walking around with some friends and these little foster dogs, and the Charlottesville locals were really into these dogs, so they got adopted like the day of because we were out there just being Darden students and enjoying the sunlight, having some wine, and you know it was really rewarding to be able to be taking care of those dogs, but also help them find a home.
Yeah, it's nice to do things that are maybe a little bit outside of your everyday MBA activities as you're going through an MBA, particularly if it's been if they've been things that are important to you, as you were kind of coming up and before you got to an MBA program. I think it's important to stay in touch with those things.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, last question, Carissa. Any additional advice for our listeners here? Obviously, you shared a lot of tips and a lot of insights, but any additional advice for folks as they think about their own MBA journeys?
Yeah. I think, I have this hot take that's come up again and again for folks. I think like looking at MBA programs and not necessarily in one just yet, but something that surprised me along the way was realizing how different programs, you know, we have all the brochures about, this many students get this amount of income after the MBA, and this many students have this, industry of job after the MBA. And something I didn't realize is that, you know, Darden and these 10 other schools might have really great relationships with BCG, because that was the case I was looking at for my internship. What I didn't kind of recognize at the time is that, Darden, for instance, has a strong kind of network and alumni contingency with the Denver office. So, going to Darden helped me to be able to get that summer internship in their Denver office. And, if I had wanted to go to Seattle, there, aren't as many. So there are these like secret little pathways. And some programs, if they're based in the Northeast or in the Bay or in the South, some of those, connections are really tight in those areas. And it's, I think, important to think about where you want to be after the MBA, just to consider in. And it's one you have to dig a little deeper on. It's not going to be kind of posted in the brochure.
One more question. I said that was going to be our last question, but maybe not.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by your micro retirement. What'd you get out of that experience, and would you do it again?
I would totally do it again. I think talk to me in 3 years, I might be on one. Um, yeah, so trying to think of the name of the book. I think it's called Quarter Life Crisis, and kind of read that leading into my micro retirement. And the first couple months, honestly, I was just like recovering on sleep, and taking my dog out on walks every day. And then eventually, I was like, all right, I'm recovered. I'm kind of bored. I want to do stuff. Um, and again, it was just that strange place of having kind of accomplished all the things that I'd set out to do. I'd had a director title. I was comfortable economically. So I was able to kind of actually sit down and think, what do I want to do with my time, as opposed to like, what do I just do to get as far ahead and make as much money and get the highest title possible. So I contemplated physical therapy. I was like shadowing in hospitals and, thinking about big pivots like that. And then also just got to, learn again what I truly enjoyed, which was a lot around animals, outdoor activities. I went on a few NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School alumni courses, since during Darden I did their Patagonia leadership course out in Chile. So got to go horse packing in the Wind Rivers in Wyoming, and sea kayaking in Croatia with my husband and some of his family. So it's really just a restorative time, and allowed me to truly, I guess, be centered and focused, and know that I wanted to be doing the job that I ended up working in, rather than just trying to bring in a paycheck.
Those sound like incredible experiences. Horse packing, sea kayaking. I mean, okay. Did you think about stretching out the micro retirement to a full retirement, just as if you could continue doing that?
It was kind of funny. So I, this probably speaks to a little bit of winning in interview processes for new jobs as well. But as I'd mentioned, I sort of stumbled into the Raven interview process, and wasn't looking for a job and had no intention of working for several more months. So, I think there's, some like intangibles that come across when negotiating and going through interview processes. I really had nothing to lose. I was just like, I'm genuinely interested in this. This is what I have to offer. And if I don't get the job, I didn't want to work anyways, because I was still in micro retirement. So yeah, I got the offer in want to say August, and started my negotiation point with I have no intention of working until April because ski season is among us, and didn't win that one outright, but started part time in October, and then just transitioned to full time in February. So it was great. It was kind of nice to ease back into things part time, and then by the end of that, I was also ready to do more. So I'm excited to be full time and have things to do with my brain again.
Well, Carissa, thank you so much for your time today. It's great talking with you about your story, and congratulations on your role in venture capital. Exciting to sort of hear how things have come together for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And that was my conversation with Carissa Sanchez, a graduate in our full-time MBA class of 2020. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, and you'd like us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. So you can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.